All right, great. Well, hello everyone. Hello from the future. Welcome to our virtual event on concentrated power and coronavirus. I'm David Dayan, and I want to throw it first to Sarah Miller, the Executive Director of the American Economic Liberties Project, who will begin this discussion. Sarah, take it away.
Hi, thanks so much. So in accordance with the circumstances that we find ourselves in, we are going to be partnering with Dave at the American Prospect to bring kind of regular virtual events to talk about some of the biggest questions that we're grappling with vis-a-vis concentrated economic power. This is something we were hoping to do when the situation was a little bit more normal, but now that we found ourselves in extraordinary circumstances, it feels even more urgent to organize these conversations and to learn together and to make sure and do what we can to rebuild an economic system that is much more sustainable and much more just and fair. So we're delighted to have Representative Buchan joining us. Lucas and Rush will speak a little bit later about some of the problems regarding supply chain fragility and the threats to public health and national security that brings. But we're really grateful to have Dave here to moderate the discussion. As everyone knows, he's the executive editor of the American Prospect, and he has a book coming out very soon, Monopolize Life in the Age of Corporate Power. So Dave, I'll turn it over to you, and then we can move right along. Thank you so much.
All right, great. So I turned it over to Sarah, and she turned it back over to me. So here I am. Thank you all for being here. You know, I think it was about 21 years ago that there was an earthquake in Taiwan that led to the inability for domestic entertainment producers to get videotape. And also semiconductor producers, semiconductors, which were concentrated in China at that time, were unable to get out because there was no power at the airport to actually ship these things away. And it caused the almost immediate stoppage of production all over the world for electronic equipment, computers and things like that. We had an inkling that this kind of thing was coming. And it was 2 decades ago that we thought about this, and that some people, very few, not enough, were considering the downsides to centralizing supply chains and the fragility that put into the system. And now we're seeing the effects of that, and we're in a moment where we really deeply need to think about once we come out of this, how we restructure so that we don't have these problems again. I want to start, because he has limited time. We're honored to have him with us. I want to introduce Representative Mark Pocan from the great state of Wisconsin. He has, among other members of Congress, talked about using in the near term something called the Defense Production Act, which would allow the federal government to requisition the production of all sorts of necessary supplies for national security purposes. I'm sure he'll talk about that, as well as you know, all the other things we're seeing around supply chains and really, you know, everything that we're seeing in this crisis, and how we can make things better in the aftermath. So without delay, I want to introduce right now Representative Pocan.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for the patience in changing the schedule slightly. It's been a very busy day. We know the White House had an hour-and-a-half press conference again on coronavirus. We're dealing with some very specific issues here in Wisconsin right now, and there's just a lot moving. So we really appreciate it, trying to get things ready for the next package that's going to be happening. It's going to be a very big package for the American people. You know, this is an issue that, as you mentioned, has been around, unfortunately, for a long time in a lot of different areas about supply chain issues, especially with production made in China. And I think this has really put this front and center for many people to realize what's happening as we're dealing with the coronavirus. I can tell you on Appropriations Committee, we have had Secretary Azar come in. I've asked the questions to him about this. We've had Dr. Fauci. I've asked questions, he and the NIH about this. We've had the CDC and we've had the FDA. We've all raised these questions. And the good news And it really is good news is that Democrats and Republicans are often asking the same questions. I think they're realizing that this has really put the fragility of what is out there front and center, and that we have to do something about it. In fact, Mike Gallagher, a Republican from Northeast Wisconsin, and myself in the House, and Josh Hawley in the Senate have put together a bill looking at medical devices and supply chains in China, just as an example of that bipartisan cooperation. So I think that's a good thing, right? Especially at a time when very little gets through Congress. Watching Congress work together and ask some of the same questions, especially on my appropriations committee, has been gratifying that people understand this is a real priority. No question, we're seeing a lot of supply chain issues. We know that China makes many prescription drugs. They make even more generic drugs. They make a considerable amount of active ingredients for drugs that are made elsewhere that you can't make the drugs without. And they also make a lot of medical devices, all things that right now we're seeing those issues very real, from ventilator shortages to reagent shortages to run tests to types of prescription drugs. And we're really trying to continue to be on top of all this. So I think there's a few things I think that'll come out of this. One, I think you're going to see a lot of legislation in a bipartisan way trying to address this. We're looking for best practice ideas from people like yourselves on how to do this, and we really appreciate recently having folks come and talk to Progressive Caucus, for example, on this issue to try to make more people understand excuse me, the scope of the overall issue. And that's been very good. I think this idea of having defense be able to produce some of the things we need right now is dealing with our issues right now that we've got to deal with, whether it be ventilators, whether it be the reagents, whether it be some of the sedative drugs for people who are on ventilators. There's a number of things that we're trying to grapple. In fact, that's been a good chunk of my day today in Wisconsin. We're running some shortages right now, and we're trying to deal with that. So very, very important. And I think it's coming on people's radar screens. I do think that we will be able to probably address this as we're moving forward. Whether or not it becomes a full scope of this, I think some of it will. My only problem a few weeks ago is when I asked Secretary Azar this very question about the supply chain, and his answer was, well, it could cost, even a penny a pill would really be a lot for the pharmaceutical industry to produce it in the U.S. And then I think of the Hep C drug that's $1,000 a pill, and I'm not so worried about the penny a pill to keep a supply chain open, right? And I think really that conversation from 2 weeks ago is almost like 10 years ago in time with all that's happened, and more people are very aware of what we need to do. So the good news is I think you have bipartisan cooperation on talking about what we need to do next. We're looking to groups like yourselves and others about how to address this. I think that is something that will be front and center even after this immediate crisis is done, because I hear the intensity of the conversations that we have, and whether it be figuring out ways to get production back in the U.S., whether it be Department of Defense using some of their resources and ability to get things done so we can have things produced as we need them right now, especially at a time where it's not just China could slow down production because they have the virus spreading, but China could also decide anything produced in a factory is going to stay in China for domestic use first. And that's one of the problems we have with the supply chain issues. And I think everyone is starting to understand those questions. And I think that I would just leave it with, I think that's good news. In a bipartisan way, members of Congress are asking the same questions. And that tells me we're a few steps ahead of where we are in virtually most every issue that we fight about. And we're going to be looking to folks like yourselves for more guidance on this.
Well, great. Thank you, Representative. I guess we have you just for a few minutes. So if I can ask you just one or two questions, I think that would be great. First of all, what has the issue come up within Congress around the way in which after the supply chain actually takes place, the concept of just-in-time logistics and the fact that very low inventories are being held in these facilities, where you're talking about medical facilities or really any facilities, and what that does to resiliency and stability. I think one of the big problems is that we've outsourced these facilities, but we've also decided to cut inventories to the bone because we don't want to, because corporations don't want to pay for actually holding this stuff. And we're seeing the effects of that now. So is that being talked about in Congress?
So there have been questions really around BARDA and our own ability as a government to have some of the stockpiles and those issues, so that whether it be masks, whether it be ventilators, whether it be certain types of drugs, we're addressing it and having a better, excuse me, national reserve. So that absolutely is a part of the conversation. One thing I failed to mention, and if it's all right, I'm going to mention here too. Recently, Pramila Jayapal and I, on behalf of the Progressive Caucus, did a letter to about 20 of the top pharmaceutical companies, asking them a bunch of questions about their supply chain, because we don't have a lot. The FDA has some information, but we don't really have a national repository of where everyone gets their ingredients, where the drugs come from, all the rest. And honestly, it came out of a conversation sitting down with some folks who've been very active with you all, Matt Stoller and others, so that we could realize that was an issue to press. And I don't think we've gotten a lot of responses yet, but we're working on it. We're going to continue to work on it because we think it is important, that is in the public interest to have that mapping.
Yeah, this is an amazing point that you raised, that we literally don't have the information of where these various ingredients come from. And it seems to me it would be a simple mandate to make the manufacturers keep track of that information. And, you know, I mean, the burden of paperwork or whatever they're going to say in response to that pales in comparison to what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, and it's not proprietary information. Often people try to put ideas like that out there. You know, if you're getting an active ingredient, it's an active ingredient that maybe for many drugs, you know, we should know where that's coming from, because even if that drug is made somewhere else, that could provide a shortage. We know many of the drugs that are made in India, where many drugs are made, often the active ingredients come from China. So really, so much right now is reliant on China. And we just can't have that. This, of all things, has put it forward on every area, from drugs to reagents to ventilators. You're talking about medical devices, active ingredients, and actual drugs, all potentially in shorter supply. And without a good idea on supply chains, this shows the whole mass of this issue.
Okay, great. Last question. On the short-term issue with using the Defense Production Act, the president was asked today about this. He said that his administration has been looking at it for a couple of weeks, but he said it was a big step, and he wanted to think more about whether to go towards that if we need the increased capacity. It seems clear to me that we actually do need the increased capacity. And you know, what are your thoughts on how to you know, continue the pressure on the administration to actually take that step?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to have Congress continue to do that pressure. And I think you're seeing that with legislation, with people talking about it, you know, trying to get to that point. But clearly right now, we know there's a ventilator issue. And the answer telling states to deal with it on their own is not an answer that anyone really finds acceptable. The fact that we know right now we're dealing with some shortages, even in my home state, potentially on getting things, has got great concern. And I've spent a good chunk of the morning dealing with that. I think, you know, we're realizing that this probably has to happen sooner than later. And much like the conversations from 2 weeks ago with this administration, and now look like there's completely, you know, they're different. I think this conversation will be different as time moves on.
Okay. Well, we know you need to get back to the critical work that you're doing. Thank you so much for being with us.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Take care.
All right. Okay. We're going to move on to our presentations with our great guests. I'm going to introduce them. But first, let me mention to the people in the audience, there are a couple ways that you can get involved in this and line up questions that we can then put to our panelists. One way is to use the chat tool, and any chat question that you have we can do it that way. Another way is there is a button down at the bottom of the screen called Raise Your Hand, and if you raise your hand in the Q&A section, I can then unmute you and have you ask the question. So there's a couple ways to get involved. I'm going to move on to our presentations. So we have two great guests with us. First of all, Lucas Kuntz, who is a fellow at the American Economic Liberties Project. And we also have Rush Doshi, who directs the China Strategy Initiative at the Brookings Institution. They're going to talk about these issues, how we got here, and what we might be able to do to get out of it. So I'm going to start with Lucas. If you could just sort of give a brief rundown of your thoughts in this extraordinary time.
Thanks, David. Sure, I'm happy to do that. Just a little more background about myself. I'm a U.S. Marine officer And right now I do acquisitions at the Defense Innovation Unit, buying stuff for the military. I'm the deputy general counsel there. And then prior to that, I worked on the joint staff as an international negotiator. And so when I look at the current situation, the lens I'm looking at it through is a national security lens and a national security vulnerability lens. And so kind of the way that I see this COVID-19 scenario is almost like a war game where we're seeing what could happen if a supply chain was disrupted. And it's not a full disruption, but the main point of the whole war game analogy is that I think we need to take a good hard look at the lessons learned, at our structure and everything that we have going on to see how we can adapt, because I can guarantee you that China is looking at what these disruptions are causing to us, any levers that they can pull behind the scenes or even overtly in the future, and what sort of leverage they can get out of that. So if we're not doing our part to figure out how to stop that, we are behind the power curve. And also, I mean, previously I did in international negotiations, I was doing arms control negotiations with mostly Russia. And one of the big things that you want in a negotiation is some sort of leverage, right? And right now, it's hard to tell who's in the better position as far as leverage goes. And so we need to figure that out, and we need to make sure that we find ourselves in a position where we're not giving away the barn or whatever else because we don't have leverage in future negotiations. Let's see. As far as how we got here and the overall problem, the congressman talked a little bit about the medical supply chain. In 2018, DoD released a report from a task force that looked into military supply chain vulnerabilities, and we found out that we can pretty much make absolutely nothing without relying on China. And that means like the Joint Strike Fighter, a lot of the components that go into it, communications, chaff that comes out of the back of an airplane to deflect a rocket or a missile guidance system, pretty much anything. So if we want to not lose leverage, those would be good industries to try to retain. I know we talked about the Defense Production Act. The president did over the summer and fall invoke the Defense Production Act, just one of the small parts of it to say we need to focus on rare earth minerals. And rare earth elements, they go into batteries and small electronic devices. And that's an important one that China's tested in the past, where we can see that China is willing to play economic games in order to get what they want in a national security sphere. In 2010, for example, Japan caught a Chinese fishing trawler in their territory. They held the fishing trawler and were trying to get some sort of concessions out of China, and China just shut down the rare earth exports to Japan. Japan backed off and didn't get what they wanted. So they know the lessons here, and not to go too far because I want Rush to talk. I think that the problem for us is when we look at what's going on, the real baseline problem is I would say it's structural, and so we're going to have like a COVID-19 bailout or any distributions of money or discussions of the supply chain aren't going to be enough. The real structural problem that we see is that in the 1980s, you had the shareholder revolution, and every single incentive in our financial structure and our industrial structure since then is focused on maximizing shareholder value, maximizing share price. And so what we see is that eventually you run out of efficient ways to do that. And what's happened is that executives with that mandate have converted risk into profit. And so, the risk is that we have a supply chain now that's so tight that any little disruption to it or pull on it and it's going to break. And so to close my thoughts on this, my real concern is that this isn't a concern. I mean, it would be good if we got through COVID-19, but my concern related to that structural problem is that we're going to make it through COVID-19. It's not going to be really, really bad. It's just going to be bad. People are going to forget about it. The lobbyists who are behind the current structural incentives are going to be able to maintain the inertia. And we're not going to get a change until there's a real disaster, which would be, a real shame because all the signs are there. We should be learning from the lessons that we see.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Lucas. Yeah, I mean, this bring up a lot of thoughts for me. One about, after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, which knocked out a bunch of its capabilities. Baxter International does about half of IV bags production on that site. This is salt and water in a bag, and we were having shortages of it actually for 5 years before the Baxter shutdown during Hurricane Maria. And that has to do with contracting practices and a whole other things that lead to this lack of resiliency. But it was literally the case, and there's a chapter in my book about this, where there were shortages of salt and water in a bag. And I have a scene with an individual who was getting a cancer treatment, and they said there's no salt and water available. There's no saline solution available for this IV, so I'm going to have to do it manually. And they were in La Jolla, overlooking the Pacific Ocean, where there is only salt water, and they could not find salt and water in a bag. So we'll talk about a little bit more about those issues a little later, but it shows you that this is a structural problem, as Lucas was saying. I want to bring in Rush Doshi now and have you talk about this issue from your expertise. Please take it away, Rush.
Sure. Yeah, thanks so much, David. And thanks also, Lucas, for those great comments. I work primarily on Chinese foreign policy, but so much of Chinese foreign policy is about economics. They tend to think of economics as an instrument of foreign policy, the same way that other countries do. The difference is they can make a lot of the things that other countries need. Now we're finally seeing what the implications are of China controlling manufacturing in key sectors that are critical at a time of crisis. So our initiative, basically what we try to do is we mass digitize and acquire a lot of Chinese texts, and we use those to basically reverse engineer what we think Chinese strategy is, and then come up with US policy responses. We've really been focused a lot on supply chain issues recently because they're critical. I mean, as Lucas kind of alluded to, China has not been reluctant to use its supply chain leverage with countries all over the world, from Norway to the Philippines to Japan to Korea to Australia, and down the list it goes, and now increasingly with the United States. So let's talk about two things. First, I want to go over some of the critical medical goods that we're going to need in this moment and China's role in producing them. And then second, what the implications might be if China decides to get a bit tougher with them. So the first set, there's basically four goods that I and a lot of others are focused on, right? Number one is masks. Number two is respirators. These are often called N95 respirators, right? Designed to keep out pathogens to some degree. They're also used to keep out fine particulate matter. Number three is ventilators, which we've been talking a lot more about recently. And number four, of course, as we've been discussing, is APIs. In each of the four categories, with one exception, China is overwhelmingly the market leader. The one exception, from my own understanding, is actually ventilators, where US and European firms tend to be actually dominant in global market share. Let's just go through that list real quick. I mean, on masks, the assumption is that the US has less than 1% of the number of masks that it needs in order to respond to the crisis. And that's if you count the masks that are in the strategic national stockpile and outside that stockpile, less than 1%. And that 1% is probably generous, as the estimates have been revised based on hospital usage over the last week. Number two, if you go to those respirators I was talking about, those are critical for healthcare providers because they help keep those providers from getting sick. When this stuff was going around in Wuhan, China, some of the highest casualty rates were among doctors and nurses because they were working to the bone, they were exhausted, their immune systems were compromised by that exhaustion. They didn't have all the gear that they needed to stay safe. So keeping medical providers safe is critical to our health security, but we can't even make 1%. We don't even have 1% of the respirators we need either. In both masks and respirators, China is overwhelmingly the producer. So for respirators, China has about more than half of the global supply of respirators. It can make more than half, and it's scaling that up. It's maybe tripled some of its factories in the last week or two. Now, a good portion of that production in China, making those N95 respirators that we need, is actually owned by US companies like 3M. Our own companies are in China making those products. The problem is something the congressman alluded to. He said, well, what if China requires manufacturers to keep that stuff at home? That's already happened. China is effectively buying all the N95 respirators directly from the factory, whether it's US or a Chinese factory, and keeping it. And that's after it already purchased millions of these N95 masks as its own crisis was unfolding. So now it's not only bought up the supply, but it also is monopolizing the capacity. And that is actually putting our healthcare providers at risk. As one example, in one New Jersey hospital in one day, Friday, I think it was Friday, it may have been Saturday, they went through almost, I don't know, 700 or 800 of these masks, respirators in one day alone. It gives you a sense of the scale of the problem. Finally, on the question of ventilators, there's been a lot of different estimates about how many we have. No one really has a good sense. The administration was not forthcoming about that. We do have a good number in the stockpile, but it's well below 10% of what's estimated to be needed if we have an actual pandemic, anything like one we had 100 years ago. So we're in the tens of thousands of respirators that we have. We're probably in the 800,000 range of what we need, less than 10% available. And of course, many of those respirators that we do have are outdated, probably not always appropriate depending on the patient. So there's a lot of other complexities in that situation. There are efforts in the US and Europe to scale up respirator production, but as we just saw today, some of these respirator manufacturers, they're not scaling up unless they got a contract. And that's where you need the federal government to step in and start supplying the funds. Even China's not going to be able to produce the respirators that we need. Well, I won't go into APIs that are important for antibiotics, but let me just put it this way. Coronavirus, secondary bacterial infections are critically important. That's often one of the most dangerous parts of the virus, the bacterial infection that comes after, especially if you're in the hospital. And obviously antibiotics are critical to that. We're probably going to have a shortage, and it's already been reported that hospitals have been trying to stock up for the last 2 months, but they'll run through them. At that point, we'll be importing them from China. To just end very quickly here, what does all this mean? Well, there is a dependence on China for 3 of these 4 products. China has already suggested through its state media, although there's questions of how authoritative this is, that it could play games with some of that, that it might actually withhold some of those exports. Now, it's not likely to happen because that would almost be an act of war from the perspective of Chinese and American officials alike, not one that would actually result in shooting, but it's still inflammatory. But it could happen. And right now, we just saw that China is expelling New York Times, Washington Post, and all Wall Street Journal reporters from the country. We're in uncharted waters in that relationship. A lot more can go wrong. So it's critically important right now that we start, as the congressman suggested, mobilizing industrial production yesterday so that we can make a lot more of this at home. And I think that's certainly possible. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. You and Lucas also brought up the sort of globalization nightmare scenario, this idea that countries could withhold exports to use it for their own populations of these critical supplies, which would just put a tremendous strain on export-dependent countries like the United States. We've seen this already in India. We've seen this in Germany, which said they're not exporting any masks. They're using them for their own domestic use. This is one of the things that kind of keeps me awake at night. I'll leave it to Rush or Lucas to take this, but what do you think can be done in this scenario? There doesn't seem to be a good solution for this kind of act of war, as you say, Rush.
Well, I'll just jump in and say that 5 years ago, the U.S. helped coordinate the response to Ebola. Part of that coordination also means ensuring that supplies of critical medical goods are flowing normally throughout, between us, our allies, and our partners. There's none of that happening now. There's no coordination, and nobody stepped up. It turns out America first, if defined very narrowly, isn't really useful for coordinating a global response. And so that's part of why we're seeing countries go their own way. And so the only real hope here, and it's not totally likely to change even if the U.S. steps up now, is to boost domestic production and allied production and create more slack in a market that right now is quite tight. And I think that's doable, especially with masks, maybe with ventilators. It's a little harder to do with respirators, but we can get into that later.
Okay. Lucas, did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, my only thought is that I think I kind of said it before, but I think that there's a chance that before we're able to ramp up production for this, the crisis or the pandemic is kind of going to come down and meet where production is. So I don't know if we have enough time to do it, but we need to make all effort to do that. But regardless of how that turns out or the success of that, we need to start planning for the future. And so whatever that looks like, structural changes, temporary and permanent, we need to start looking at how the future is going to look like so that we don't find ourselves in this position again. Because, if whatever the fatality percentage is of this disease, who knows what the next one's going to look like, who knows where it's going to be. And every time we just move on without making a structural change, the current system gets worse.
Agreed. It's a self-protection issue. And self-sufficiency. I'm going to take a question here from our chat. This is from Victor Huang, and he says, there's lots of discussion here about making our supply chain less fragile, but mostly about large corporations. Is anyone considering the importance of more nimble entrepreneurs in diversifying our supply chain and how we can support them? So this idea of smaller producers being able to pick up the slack. Lucas, do you want to try to take that?
Yes, I'll jump in on that. So that is, yeah, I mean, one of the great ideas is that if you have distributed production, you're much more resilient. You see it, when we talk about it in the national security sphere, one of the things we look at a lot of the time is electricity. When you just have a couple power plants fueling an entire country, you're very vulnerable, especially to cyber attack, if one of those power plants can be taken offline or something like that. And now one of the sort of, it's not exactly the same, but it's a good analogy, is now that all these houses have solar panels on them, it makes us a little bit more resilient. And if we continue to do that and continue to double it down, once the electric grid is distributed enough, then we have a certain resiliency through that. So I agree with that concept. However, I would say that the reason we're not talking about small businesses is because consolidation, mergers, and acquisitions have been so intense over the last couple of decades that there aren't enough small businesses left to be able to do that. And so the only way that we're going to be able to address that situation is through structural changes in or advocacy changes in antitrust, in competitiveness, in mergers and acquisitions. We're going to have to put some sort of oversight on the M&A activities. And I mean, I have several other ideas for fixes that we could try, but as far as competition goes in small businesses, we have small businesses that are started at a lower rate than they've ever been in this country, and most of the ones that are started are just being bought out if they're successful. So that structural system is going to have to be fixed before we think about relying on distributed production.
Great. Rush, did you have something?
Well, not much. I'll just say it's a great point. I think Lucas said everything that I would have added. I just want to give a little bit of context on one question. We tend to think that China is all about big corporations, big state enterprises. That's true as far as it goes. But interestingly, in the coronavirus response, it's a little bit all hands on deck. You're getting the folks, small factories that make beds or garments or underwear to get in the mask game. In other words, they're getting their small businesses up and running and mobilized to be able to respond to the crisis. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of what U.S. mobilization looked like, based on historical accounts. Around the time of the Second World War, we did have smaller businesses, manufacturing companies. Maybe it made tin cans one day, you're making something else the next, and the government repurposed them. So if we can if we can diversify, as Lucas said, our manufacturing capability, it's not just the hands of a handful of big companies or factories. It actually creates slack in a crisis because we can then reconvert the base a little bit faster.
Yeah, absolutely. And wartime mobilization is definitely what we need to be thinking about now. I have another question that I want to go to. This is from Sarang Shah. It's a two-part question. Asks, do we have latent capacity to ramp up production of pharmaceuticals and medical equipment, or are we looking at a sort of WPA style state economic project that has to build up this capacity? And as a follow-up, is there anything that states can do, maybe large states like California, New York, to rebalance incentives towards localizing supply chains, or is this just a federal issue? Anyone? Yeah, okay, Raj.
That's a great question, and as a China person, I'll kind of confine my knowledge to my answers to some of my own knowledge. But on the question of is this do we have slack capacity? So I've been looking at this issue from the perspective of what happens if they start tightening the supply chain and squeezing us. In ventilators, there are reports that some of our manufacturers, again, the 10 biggest makers of ventilators, at least according to market research, so they're looking in the U.S. and Europe. Some of them, like GE, are probably operating close to capacity. Others, smaller companies that don't have as much, they need to be a bit more careful with how they allocate their cash flow and especially their manufacturing, are not at capacity. And so some of them have said, hey, we can go 5x from where we are now. We just need a contract to guarantee that if we start making this stuff, someone's going to buy it. And as Lucas said, that, if all of a sudden we don't need it, we're not going to go under. So there has been a lot of questions surrounding this. Will this stuff abate fast? And if it does, should I bother investing in ramp up? I think the assumption has to be, well, it's not going to abate quickly from an industrial perspective. And that requires, in my view, a federal response. But we have seen states get involved in manufacturing some of this stuff in the past and even in the present. So there's definitely room for big, wealthy states to kind of give grants to their own industries. If the U.S. government isn't going to, invoke the Defense Production Act, then there are ways states can do stuff on their own as well. And so I think it's going to be a little bit of both.
Okay, great.
And so I see that a lot in the national, the Defense Innovation Unit where I work. Our job is to purchase commercial products that are dual use goods and bring them into the military. And we're seeing that in hardware situations, for example, a lot of venture capitalists aren't interested in investing in hardware because the time horizon for a payback on that is very long versus software. China actually used to fund a lot of it before the CFIUS firmware reforms. And so what we're trying to do is brainstorm ways like if in order to get U.S. venture capitalists interested, what you need to see is these production contracts. There has to be some sort of sale, like long-term or large sale at the end, in order to infuse capital for these production lines to even ramp up. I mean, with the type of hardware we're looking at, it's not pharmaceuticals, it's not ventilators, but it's the type of thing that there needs to be a market for, and there needs to be a guaranteed market for, because picking up a production line or shifting a production line costs a lot of money, and unless they see that on the other end, the money's not going to get there to begin with. So the government can either put the money into, maybe state governments could put money in to get production lines up and running first, or have some sort of contract on the back end that inspires confidence that they'll make money off of that.
Right.
Let me just add one more thing.
Yeah, go ahead, Russ.
Oh yeah, just want to add, there's one other thing I want to talk about, which is just the respirators that I mentioned earlier that are pretty critical for healthcare providers right now. There turns out, although they look kind of, easy to make, and you put them on your face, they're kind of cheap, they're not expensive to buy, they're really hard to make. And the respirators in particular rely on a machine that produces what's called melt-blown fabric. That's sort of the bottleneck of the respirator manufacturing process. Now, it turns out one of those machines costs something like $5 million. So even in China where there's tons of state capital flowing into the system, some of the manufacturers are saying, hey, unless you're giving me a big payout, I cannot buy these machines to produce the melt-blown fabric. So for some of this stuff, it's really going to require capital equipment. And there, we can't be waiting for private investors. It's really wartime mobilization style, the U.S. government putting in $1 billion. That's sort of what's needed in my view. And even if we overshoot, we get more than we need, that's a good thing, because this virus is not going to be contained to the U.S. If it comes back in China, it comes back in Italy, it's going to come back here. So we've got to get this equipment produced in the U.S. And then we've got to get it, when we're okay, we've got to get it out in the world. And right now, there's simply not enough global capacity. So part of being a global leader is being a global public goods provider. And so that's one of the things I'm hoping that, if we do get this stuff right, we're actually able to help fight the fires, not at home, but abroad as well.
Thank you, Rush. I think one other aspect of this we should talk about briefly is know-how and sort of the institutional muscle of production capability in the United States. I know AALP went to the Small Business Committee in the Senate last week and brought a list of comments that were made by various lobbyists and representatives of industry to the U.S. Trade Representative's office around the time that the tariffs were being put on China. And all of these large corporations were arguing against the tariffs, specifically saying that we had no capability to make any of these goods in the United States. And the most amusing one of those was some evangelical organization that said, we have no capability to make Bibles in the United States. This is literally something that goes back to the mass production of the 15th century of Gutenberg, and said that, no, we can't do it anymore. They have specialized equipment, and we can't make Bibles here. They can only be made in China. So part of this, I think, eventually has to be some kind of ramping up of the actual knowledge and capability within the United States, because when you break down your industrial base, it ends up rebounding back on this inability to even ramp up when you have to. So there's no slack in the system. Yeah, go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and say that's exactly right. And there's two kinds of knowledge to some degree that you can sort of think about it in two ways. There's the knowledge of how you make stuff, how you make a particular good. That kind of knowledge you can sort of figure out by reading about industrial techniques in other countries. And okay, I need this kind of machinery, I need this kind of engineering process, whatever. There's a second kind of knowledge which is more critical and more close to the factory floor. And that's the tacit knowledge. That is the kind of knowledge that is not automatic. You can't read it in a book. It's the kind of knowledge that emerges from being involved in the process. In America, we have a lot of tacit knowledge when it comes to things like making turbines for jet engines. China can't replicate that even if it steals some of our computer files. It requires physical experience. Now, we've lost some tacit knowledge too as we've deindustrialized. So this, to Lucas's point, we're not going to be able to just make a bunch of ventilators and say we did it, we reindustrialized the United States. This has to be a longer term strategy where we convert the risk that other companies are using as profit back into something that is a public good, or rather we reduce the risk for the sake of the public good in the United States. And so it's different kinds of knowledge that we have to sort of start thinking about here. And we've lost one of them, and we hopefully can get it back.
Right. So let me go to another question, and thank you for your questions. There are a lot of them coming in, and I'm trying to use as many as possible. This is from Avery Gardner, and this one actually might end up being for Sarah. Listen in. The panelists are primarily talking about efficiencies in supply chains, offshoring by big corporations, but not the sorts of harms that antitrust law and merger analysis typically contemplate. Maybe for Sarah, are the solutions here ones that live in competition policy or in national security and fostering small business, or do they lie somewhere else? So maybe talk about this in the context of antitrust and merger policy.
Yeah, so I'll kind of go big picture for a minute, right? So I think this conversation is one slice of how we've created a really kind of fragile and unjust kind of economic structure across the board by pursuing policies and embracing ideologies centered around concentrating economic power and incentivizing kind of financial actors to essentially extract power and wealth from businesses that are actually making things, from workers, from communities. And that's been a project that's been ongoing since the early 1980s, after kind of an ideological revolution in the 1970s that both conservatives and progressives embraced for somewhat different reasons, but has been sort of the operating system of the way that policymakers think, right? Market structure wasn't something that was really considered. These problems were not thought about in that context. And, I think one of the most astonishing things to me as I've started to work on this issue and study is just to see kind of how obvious a lot of these deep flaws and injustices were if you really start looking at these questions through these lenses. So because of concentrated economic power, not only do we have supply chain fragility and threats to national security and public health, right? And that's exacerbated and driven by these large corporations that can then pressure producers and suppliers to kind of streamline and strip out production even further. But you have problems with innovation, right? You have problems with retaining this broad base of knowledge across society in these sorts of commercial activities. So from my perspective, there isn't a silver bullet here, and I think you need to kind of stop the economic concentrations of power that will only exacerbate this problem, and you need a range of tools to do that. Really, I think what we're trying to drive and seed is a change of consciousness vis-a-vis how people in the general public, in advocacy organizations, and think tanks, in government are considering corporate power in fundamental ways, and then pulling a lot of different levers, both at the federal and the state and even the local level, to start to turn that around. So here is an example where the problem is hitting us in the face. We are going to need to put a lot of money, the government is going to put a lot of money into solving these life or death problems that markets are not going to solve for us. And in fact, markets have made much, much worse. That's something that we're going to need to get comfortable with really quickly if we want to prevent a lot of people from dying for starters. And then over the longer term, as Lucas has talked about, if we want to kind of cushion these sorts of shocks and actually create an economic and market structure that isn't premised around concentrating power in the hands of a very narrow group of individuals. So that's how we think about it. There isn't one answer. Antitrust is a tool and it's a critical part of it. But especially as we're thinking about these supply chain issues and we're thinking about, the bailouts that are absolutely going to need to happen, we shouldn't do that by just, allowing kind of the largest corporate actors or financial institutions to like pillage society, essentially. We need to support this kind of fundamental rebuilding that has to happen, support workers, support families, and support smaller businesses and smaller institutions. Because I think, one of my fears is that, basically the small business sector is going to go extinct if we don't find ways to support them proactively. So I hope that's somewhat helpful. It's a massive problem, but it really starts, I think, in many ways with conversations like these to put people in a different mindset, in a different framework vis-a-vis the role of government and the role of the private sector.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think that was excellent. I have another set of questions from Patrick Malloy, who actually was a commissioner on the U.S.-China Economic Security Review Commission, which is sort of a bipartisan think tank in Congress on China issues. And he asks, do we not have to ask where we have a corporate governance problem, where our multinational corporations focused only on shareholder value, as we mentioned, have been incentivized to outsource our productive capacities to enrich their shareholders and top management? So is there a corporate governance kind of solution here that we should think about? Lucas?
Yes, I think there's both a corporate governance and an overall sort of trade or competition aspect to this that sort of go together. And the main point on the corporate governance side of the house is, again, I think it goes back to the shareholder revolution. And I'll give an example of how this affected us on the national security side. So, and it pretty much goes back to our interpretation of capitalism. If everyone pursues their own self-interest, everything's just going to work out great, right? And then self-interest has now been defined as stock price. And so there's this company called iRobot, which some of you may be familiar with because it makes Roomba vacuums. It wasn't really doing a lot in the early 2000s, and the United States government, through the Defense Advanced Research Program, gave them a bunch of money to develop robots to disable bombs. And so they created some robots, and they worked on their technology, and at the same time they refined the product known as the Roomba, which cleans a lot of people's houses. And everyone who worked, they had a vice admiral as their COO or CEO or something like that. They're very defense oriented. They had this defense sector that sort of was subsidized by the house cleaning vacuums once we didn't need as much supply of anti-bomb robots in Iraq, right? So that area that was profitable kind of went down, and maybe someday it's needed again and it goes up again. They were mitigating that roller coaster ride of what the defense needs by using the commercial side of the house. And so what happened was a hedge fund investor bought 6% of the stock, came in. His name's William Mestag, and he sent in a hostile shareholder letter and said he was going to get rid of all the board members if they didn't completely jettison their defense business. And they were working on several robots for us at the time. The directors didn't want to do that, but they eventually felt that they had no choice. They killed it. Now, every Roomba robot is made in China, and they do absolutely nothing for the defense sector anymore, even though the defense sector bankrolled them at one point. And so what I'm getting at here is I think there are opportunities for, and this is going to be controversial, so I'm just brainstorming here, but for the government to not just give grants, but maybe take equity positions when they save a company. And, what do they say on the board of directors? Maybe they're not, take a directorship spot. Now, maybe they're not exactly like your normal member of a board of directors, but they have some sort of like veto power over certain types of decisions that could be made. I don't know. But there are lots of opportunities for the government, especially if we're talking bailouts right now. We had a lot of bailouts in the past that led to large executive compensation packages, shareholders keeping all of their value and the public really kind of getting screwed. And so if we're going to go in there and we're going to bail people out again, which it looks like we're going to do, then perhaps we should protect our position and protect our societal needs by using that bailout to take some sort of equity position and influence in the future, rather than just funding compensation. And then another thing that we could do is have something like a constituent statute, which is the constituency statute. They have different names. Some states have them. And so what that is it's this idea that, right now, corporate executives, they see their fiduciary duty basically just to shareholders. We need to maximize value. We need to maximize profit. Whether that's actually true or not, I'm going to push that aside and just say that's how they think. But some states have put in constituency statutes, which lets them take into account other equities, or it actually mandates taking into account other equities depending on how you do it. And so, you could say you have to think about the equities of workers. You have to think about the equities of national security, your suppliers. There's all sorts of things that you could add in there, and then that gives them just another corporate governance mechanism to say, let's say if you're at iRobot, you can say, you know what, hedge fund manager, I don't just answer to shareholders. I also answer to employees. I answer to my previous funders, DARPA, whatever else, my constituents. So that's another method of corporate governance that we could look at.
Great. I'm getting a lot in the chat of yes to equity stakes, thumbs up. So thank you.
Well, you don't hear that a lot in the circles that would be making the decisions on equity stakes. So
fair enough. But that's what these discussions are for, of course. So I want to go to another question. This is from Christopher Gopal. He says he's a supply chain professional who was part of the panel on China and trade a few years ago. And it's related to what Lucas was just talking about. He says, I believe the private sector will not act in terms of national security, whether it be in local manufacturing, IP retention, or supply chain robustness. It's always CEO and founder compensation first, along with investment house return. So how would we work to get the government to mandate, stock, or invest to support a national security policy while mitigating the power of the pharmaceutical industry lobby? Are there any ideas? I want to take this real briefly because at the Prospect last fall, we did a series called the Day One Agenda, which looked at things that the next president could do without legislation to advance policy. And one of them was using, there are a couple different forms of this, but one of them is called eminent domain for patents. And that basically says that if a pharmaceutical manufacturer isn't providing the particular pharmaceutical on, quote, reasonable terms, that the government can step in and say, we're going to seize that patent, we're going to give it to a local producer to produce it in an affordable fashion. We will give you just compensation, as we are supposed to do under the eminent domain statute, but we're going to do this. And I think that is a way that we really need to start considering, like now, as a means to these critical supplies that we absolutely need, whether it's acetaminophen, which is something that India has restricted some of the usage of, or some of these antibiotics that are made almost all in China. This is a means to maybe get through to that point. And at least on a temporary basis, the US used this actually during our last crisis when they needed a response to anthrax. There was this drug called Cipro that Bayer owned. And Bayer said that we'll produce it, but we're going to produce it with a high markup. And Tommy Thompson, the Republican Secretary of Health and Human Services, said, we're going to seize your patent if you do that. And that was enough for Bayer to say, okay, we'll give it to you for less than $1 a pill. So some of this is just forcing the issue at some level, and forcing the if we're going to keep these things in private hands, forcing those manufacturers to act in the national security interest. So I don't know if anybody else said anything on that, but I wanted to bring that out. Okay, let's move on then. Michelle Miller had a question that I think is really interesting, and we've had a few questions around this, and this is about labor. the tension between capital and the value of labor. We've been trying to support, for example, regional wholesale food production and have begun to address market structure, but the value of labor is much harder to improve and is critically necessary to make regional production possible. So how do we manage that if we want to build in the supply chain resiliency, making sure that it's done in a way that respects labor and make sure that people are being compensated fairly?
So I think that one of the issues here that we've seen in the past, and how one of the reasons we got into this situation, is the competitive advantage of offshoring for labor costs, right? And so back in the 40s, there was a negotiation around something called the Havana Charter, which would have been a trade agreement that sort of diluted competitive advantage, the wage-based competitive advantage, by including, workers' rights, workers' compensation, and things like that, that would level out the playing field. I think that in America we have several issues. Actually, I don't think it's just labor. I think we also, where we lose a competitive advantage, we lose it on the environment frequently. We lose it on our willingness to protect intellectual property, which could be addressed to the eminent domain issue. We lose it based on state-based financing and backing that you see in China. So all of these things have led to a degree of offshoring, and you can either use positive reinforcement or the carrot or the stick to try to bring those back. But this is a doom and gloom prophecy. I think that actually the way that this is going to be solved in the future, that brings all production back to America, or at least a lot of it, is going to be technology, and it's going to be automation, to the point where when machines are more cost efficient and more effective, cheaper, faster, better than humans, we're going to find ourselves producing a lot more in this country, but it's going to bring its own host of other problems to it. So I guess the question is, do we want to try to accelerate towards that state by investing in that sort of automated technology and things like that, while preparing for the inevitable societal disruption that's going to bring, or do we want to try to keep it how it is? I don't know, but I don't have good answers, but those are the competitive advantages that we're facing right now that we have to try to adjust.
Great. Sarah? Yes?
Just one quick point. That's a really good question. And there's no doubt that across the board, we need a lot stronger labor regulations and, ways to prevent the extraction of wealth from working people to executives and the financial sector of the economy. I think just looking kind of big picture, we've set up this economic structure to where, we're squeezing everyone right at the bottom. We're squeezing all the value out as we concentrate corporate power at the top. And then, I'm almost 38 years old. This is a second financial crisis today. And what's happening is we're squeezing down, oh, things are going okay, right? And then, we've $18 trillion in wealth was, just got vaporized, right, in the housing crisis. And I think we need to, at this point now that we're seeing a similar experience play out, we need to kind of understand that the way that our economy is structured is now predisposing us for significant wealth accumulation at the top, significant political power accumulation at the top, and then this gross amount of instability. So if you have a housing crash, if you have a pandemic, it kind of wipes out wealth and creates this enormously destabilizing situation for the broader global economy. So maybe the fact that we, not even really a decade ago, we were kind of experiencing these similar types of shocks, and this one might be even worse, to kind of grapple with the ways that we've structured these basic dynamics in our economy so that it is actually sustainable. We avoid these sorts of problems, and we have kind of broadly shared wealth and also a much more resilient economic system. We are set up for neither of those things right now. And so hopefully this time around, as we're experiencing this and developing solutions and working together, trying to learn from each other, which is what this little conversation is hoping to start to contribute to. we can get on the right track for these bigger structural questions, which Lucas and Rush have been speaking to.
Great. Rush, I see you have you're ready to bring something in, and hopefully we have time for just one more question.
Well, I'll just say, I'll keep it brief then. I was just going to say that there's this assumption over the last 40 years, it kind of emerges from the law and economics movement, that efficiency is the highest public value, right? That efficiency is the thing that matters most. But when we say that, we are making a judgment. We are saying that efficiency matters more than public health, more than labor, to answer the recent question, the previous question, more than national security. And obviously efficiency comes into contrast with those, or contestation with those, time and time again. We're seeing that now with respect to health. Lucas has talked about how it sometimes happens with respect to defense. So whenever we a priori pick one over the other as a matter of public policy, we're making decisions that take the hands out of, we're sort of making a decision that is no longer one that voters can easily weigh in on. It sort of becomes the way the judges think about things, the way the legislators think about this. It becomes sort of an innate assumption that's not challenged. But again, efficiency is just one of many competing values that the state has to balance. And so sometimes the thing that's best overall for the country's security or well-being is not the thing that, creates shareholder value or creates the most efficient economic, operation.
Okay, great.
Well
I want to go in with this last question. Sarah, if you want to follow up on that one as well as answering this, I think this is in your wheelhouse. This comes from Udit Thakur. He mentions that Amazon just recently announced it's planning to hire 100,000 new employees to deal with this unprecedented demand for home delivery. And they're also switching to only providing vital goods until the beginning of April. It says, this strikes me as a repetition of the very problems that got us here. This is on the delivery infrastructure side, but we're centralizing that and controlling retail in the hands of a dominant market player. Do you think it's urgent that we impose more stringent standards of fair conduct and common carriage on Amazon if it's likely to play this role in the near term?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is that there are a whole number of private institutions that are too big to fail, and that implies either they should be made smaller so that they're not too big to fail, or you should have potential kind of nationalization moves to nationalize some of them to make sure that they're operating in accordance with the public welfare. I think Amazon, it's going to become increasingly clear the amount of control that Amazon has over American commerce. I think there is a danger to the situation that we're in now because we can't, rely on a private institution that is not accountable to voters to structure so much of our economy and to provide for so many things that are basic and fundamental resources for families all around the country. And the other thing is, with the flip of a switch, Amazon can shut down other businesses that they are competing with as a seller on their own platform and otherwise. So I think one of the things that this crisis is throwing into sharp relief are these critical questions and choices that, at least from my perspective, I thought we would have some time to start working. But the reaction to this problem, this crisis, is going to either entrench those problems or we can start to solve those problems. And that is that's why I think we all are trying to work overtime to make sure that we don't fortify, we don't entrench, and in fact, we begin to put our economy and society on a different, more sustainable, more decentralized, and more just path forward.
Great. I think we're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank everybody for participating in this extraordinary event. We put this together in like less than a week, and I want to thank Sarah and Robin Shapiro and everyone at AALP. Thanks, of course, to Lucas and Rush for participating. Thanks to Representative Mark Pocan. Personally, I just want to say that you can find all of our coverage on this crisis at prospect.org/coronavirus. That includes the daily report that I've been doing called Unsanitized, which both is online and also comes to your email if you sign up for our emails. You can find that all at prospect.org/coronavirus. coronavirus. And Sarah, do you have anything that you want to mention, resources for people at your shop?
Yeah, I think we are just always trying to learn from people out there in the economy. So we have an email, just info@economicliberties.us. And we really are grateful and really do utilize and appreciate the stories that we get and the questions that we get and the problems that people are facing. Like, we're based in DC, we are not working in the business community, right? So like that sort of input and dialogue has been really critical. And I think allowing us as a community to make the amount of progress that we have had in educating people. So we welcome people to kind of continue to reach out proactively, in addition to all of your standards, signing up for emails and things like that.
All right, great. Same here, by the way, info@prospect.org. Any information that you have, I'm part of the Unsanitized newsletter. I'm putting that stuff forward. So thank you very much once again, and we'll try to do this again soon. We'll let you know. Thanks.